It's always a pleasure for me to come here and talk here at the library. It has been a favorite place of mine for a long, long time, and I appreciate Beth Timmerman continually asking me to come back. So I really, really appreciate that, and it's a real pleasure to be here today, where the sidewalks are clear and the temperature is down a little bit. So it's very nice. 2 years ago, I gave a talk that I called "They Built This City," and we looked at architects in Kalamazoo. Tonight what we're going to do is we're going to focus a little bit on one decade. We're going to look at the 1920s. When I did this, I actually did this because I wanted to look at one of the architectural firms that I covered a little bit 2 years ago, and that's Billingham and Cobb. And it allowed me to look even further into what was going on during that decade. This was a decade that this firm was very active in a lot of the construction, and we'll talk about that a little bit. But it just amazed me when I looked at how many other firms were building things and the kinds of things that were coming up in Kalamazoo at the time. It should be no surprise. The economy was booming, things were going well, and Kalamazoo's population was growing tremendously and needed things like new schools and other types of buildings. So I decided to entitle this "The Golden Age of Building." And for those of you who have come with me here on programs before, know that one of my biggest challenges this evening is to make sure that I follow this correctly, follow the wonderful thing I have in my hand to make sure that I'm going forward and not back. I get asked a lot about what is my favorite this, what is my favorite that, and I have to say what's very, very nice is that I've done a couple pieces for Encore magazine. I did one this month for my 5 favorite lost buildings, if there can be such a thing as a favorite lost building. And I was also asked to do my 5 favorite photographs, which was incredibly hard. But this always makes my list. This was done approximately 1915. And one of the nice things about dating photographs is there's a lot of different ways that you can date them through clothing. You can also date them through buildings. And so this one, we know that we've got the Kalamazoo building, and the other big one here that really helps us date it is the Hanselman building, which came up in 1913. So this is South Burdick Street looking north from South Street, as it's identified here. And one of the reasons why I've always loved this, not only because of the signage and the buildings that still remain on this block, for example, the hotel here, half of the hotel, the International Block, half of the building still remains. We also have the people, the randomness, as I say, of this photograph. And the one part that I really like is this woman here, all dressed in the very traditional white outfit that you would see at the time. And where she is going, I always say, is a mystery to me. So this is sort of setting our stage, because before we want to talk about the 20s, let's give you a little bit of introduction of where Kalamazoo was at that time when the decade started. It's not working for you either? All right. Next. Well, there was a wonderful publication that I came across in getting ready for this presentation. It was called "Made for You in Kalamazoo." Came out in 1920 by the Kalamazoo Police Relief Fund Association. I decided to take a couple broad statistics. Population, always a big one to look at. It had gone up by 22% between 1910 and 1920. Paled in comparison to the growth between 1900 and 1910. There was about a 60% increase in population between the first decade of the 20th century and then a 22% one the next one. At least one of the explanations for that growth in those first 10 years, one of the reasons given is the growth of some of the economy, like especially in the paper mill industry. That may have been one of the reasons. I don't know. But as far as size-wise for the community, 8.5 square miles, how do we compare that to where we are today? We are about 25.11 square miles, and we're at about, I'd say in general, 74,000 people. So when people look at 48,000, they're thinking, oh, well, geez, that's not bad compared to where we are now. But think about the fact that they are all living within probably about, 8 square miles compared to 24 square miles now. So a little bit different there. We just formed the commission manager form of government. We were one of the first communities in the United States to adopt that, and that was considered very, very progressive at that time period. Okay, I'm just going to move it.
There.
Oh, there it goes. Okay. Well, our next photograph, and I have to say this one is courtesy of the Kalamazoo Gazette archives, which is just wonderful to have, which we have at the archives at Western Michigan University. This sort of puts us in the mood. I have this at about 1920. And we have, here's Michigan Avenue. Here is Burdick Street right here. So we're right about at the side of the Burdick Hotel, where the Radisson is right now. And here's another view of the Kalamazoo building, which is now being dwarfed by the Exchange Place, being built next to it. And then here we have the Hanselman building again. Here's the First National Bank building. And so this was just a beginning. Now, these buildings, we already talked about that this building and this building was built in the first decade. This was built in the second decade. Things were just beginning. Our economy, as you see here, very, very stable, very diversified. Most of the factories, though, were located near the railroad tracks, which made sense because they needed that for transportation, which was really important. They needed that. That was some of our earlier factories would be located near water, but by this time, their transportation is going to be more important than water power. And so many of our early factories were powered by that. You can see what one of the predominant industries, paper. But of course, for those of you that know Kalamazoo history know that this was not the only thing. We also had caskets and regalia and corsets and sleds and fishing gear and mint. And we were doing pharmaceuticals with the Upjohn Company. So we had a lot of products that we were making here in Kalamazoo at the time. I still don't have the, I'm still trying to figure out the way that this photograph is positioned. It's really, really nice because the photographer has that that date on there, 1925, so right in the middle of where we want to be. And this is the Bryant Paper Mill. And yes, paper was a huge industry in Kalamazoo at the time. If we go back to the photograph, I stare at this so many times trying to get myself into position as far as the location of it. I always try to find prominent buildings. This right here, I don't know which school that is. I mean, I am still playing around with it, and I know some of you are staring at it, and you might have a better idea of where this was than I mean, I know that it's Bryant, but just trying to find the location of it is still. But you see the fields that are still here, the small houses. We see some construction going on. So 310 million pounds of paper are manufactured annually in Kalamazoo at this time in the 1920s. The Bryant paper mill actually started in 1895, so you can see the growth of this in just 30 years. Now, it was not the original paper mill on that site. The first Kalamazoo Paper Company was located on that stretch of Elcott Street. Here's another great paper mill. This is Parchment in 1925. This is KVP. And KVP originally started in 1909 on the site of a sugar beet factory. The individual who is very prominent in part of that, Jacob Kindleberger. And I love this aerial photograph because you get the idea of the feeling of Parchment. So here we have KVP. Here's the community house that Kindleberger built for his employees, where here we have Riverview. So this I know. This is Riverview right here. So here we have the community house where there is a bank right now. If you're familiar with the Parchment Library, that is located right here. And here we have Jacob Kindleberger's house. And the house is still there, but for those of you that know Parchment, know that there was a restaurant, banquet hall, whatever, built in front of it. But look at that driveway. And there was a rise on that piece of property because Jacob wanted to keep his eye on what was going on with his paper mill. So, and we'll go back to this house in a little bit. So, paper. As far as genuine manufacturing at this time period, here's the Kalamazoo Stove Company. We already talked about some of the products that Kalamazoo was making at the Stove Company in the 1920s. They had 600 people producing stoves and furnaces that went all over the country. In addition, There were 500 cars of celery shipped every year from Kalamazoo, and 60% of the world's peppermint was produced in Kalamazoo. Not grown, because remember, A.M. Todd had those farms outside, but as far as being distilled, 60% of the world's peppermint was produced and distilled in Kalamazoo. General business grew, and one of the ways that that can be shown was through construction. And in the 1920s, we also had a lot of other buildings that were being built. Many of you recognize this as the Kalamazoo Gazette building on the corner of Lovell and South Burdick Street. This was completed in 1925, and it was designed by the Detroit architect of Albert Kahn. We had a couple other Kahn buildings in Kalamazoo, and there was a new biography that was done of him last year, and I looked in the index, and I was so hoping that Kalamazoo would be included, but unfortunately we were not. This was a series, Kahn designed a series of newspaper buildings across the state for the Booth newspaper chain at this time. So Ann Arbor, Saginaw, Muskegon, Grand Rapids, some of those do not remain anymore, were designed by Booth. And what's really interesting about this building now, and for those of you that have been by that, know that that's about the only building that's left on that site. A lot of the additions were taken off by Bronson Hospital, who currently owns the building. You'll notice here that you have, well, the two figures have always been exposed. They've not been covered up. And one of them holds an hourglass, the other one holds a quill pen and a tablet to write things on. But the other things that were interesting were these printing marks that were across the middle of the building. And for many years, some of those were covered up, especially the ones in the front, as the Gazette had renovated or added on to their building. And over the last year, you could see the ones on the side, but you could see the ones on the front. And last year I did a tour, which I will be repeating this summer, on art in Kalamazoo, and we'll be looking at different artwork in downtown Kalamazoo, and we've been able to, stop there. We'll stop here at the Gazette building and look at this. It also has a very interesting Mission Revival type roof up here, which is very interesting. So, transportation, very, very important. You can have all the products that you have, but if there's no way that you can get them sent out, then what are you going to do? And we talked about already that a lot of these factories in Kalamazoo were located near trains, near train tracks. You can see the amount of freight that gets shipped annually. This was all in that little booklet that I found. It was just packed full of all kinds of information. One of the things that happened in the 1920s is we opened the first municipal airport in Michigan, called the Kalamazoo Municipal Airport. Previously, it was known as Lindbergh Field. I wonder who that was named after. I wonder how many fields and airports Mr. Lindbergh had named after him. One of the big things we see in the 1920s is the growth of residential, the growth of houses. I love this quote. 1925, when that building was built for the Gazette, they came out with a special issue that was filled with everything and anything that you would ever want to know about Kalamazoo at that time. And there's some wonderful quotes in there about this one. And it talks about the growth in the residential area, in the houses. A lot of ads in the newspaper, a lot of articles in the newspaper. This one I like for Hillcrest, which is off Oakland Drive, just past Howard Street. It would be to the east of Oakland Drive. And all the different things that they talk about, yeah, the school board is going to be building a new school. That's pretty good. Talk about how far it would take you to get downtown, public transportation. So Hillcrest. A lot of areas are being platted. This is my neck of the woods. This is Creston. This is Sunrise Heights. There also at this time was going on what we call the Back to Hills movement, not just in the 1920s, but in the teens, that encouraged people to get out of the central city, which is dirty and got all kinds of, you're too close together, and come up to nature, whether it was back to hills or back to nature. And so it's interesting when you see the way that they advertise some of these things. I've talked about this before, that in some of the advertisements they talk about that living, for example, in the West Main Hill neighborhood would be just like living in Charlevoix or on Mackinac Island. That's in the Gazette. I thought that was really very interesting. This is an article about the houses that are in Orchard Hills. And the Orchard Hills neighborhood is what you might identify as the short road, long road neighborhood. And that is also becoming built up at that time. I'm sorry that this is located this way, but there were a lot of publications that came out. I know we're trying to look at this way. This was the Parkwood neighborhood, the Parkwood Plat, which was in the Westnedge Hill neighborhood. It was on the west side of South Westnedge. And they're going to extol all the virtues of why it was good to live up on top of these hills at that time. These two photographs, this is in the Hillcrest neighborhood. This is on Hillcrest, right here. Oakland Drive would just be about here. A lot of these built in the 1920s. And this is Oakland Drive, Oakland and Winchell. And here are a couple houses here. These photographs came from the collection of Ernest Batterson, who was a local architect, and he designed a lot of these houses in this part of Kalamazoo. And fortunately, at the archives, we have a lot of those architectural drawings, which are really very nice. Businesses, well, we had another little business district in Kalamazoo in Washington Square. Now, Washington Square, this photograph is taken in the 1930s, but when you look at Washington Square, this development had been going on for a number of years, motivated because the National Driving Park, or what had been the county fairgrounds, were located just beyond Portage and Washington Street until about the 1890s, when they moved over to Recreation Park. They had been there from 1859 until the mid-1890s. And so there were some businesses on this area, but even grew even more. And one of the things at Washington Square, you could get so much there. You had grocery, you had a movie theater, you of course had a library, a branch of the Washington Square Library. And this was really getting going in the 1920s at this time. Education. Here's another quote that came out there. When you look at education, by 1920, there were 8,000 pupils going to the Kalamazoo Public Schools. About 1,100 of them were in high school. There were 14 school buildings. In addition to that, there were 2 business colleges and 2 private art schools. During the 1920s, there were 8 new school buildings that were being built. Several received additions. Population was growing. They were spreading out, and so you needed new facilities. Hillcrest was a perfect example. If you remember seeing that ad, talked about how a new school was being built. And I'm not going to go through the list of these schools. Some of the names may not seem familiar. For example, down here we have Lake Street Elementary, and in the 1930s that school's name was changed to Edison. But that was Lake Street. We have Harding, and we'll get into some of the histories about some of these schools when we go on. But many of the schools in this handout, which came out in 1927, were built in the 1920s. As far as colleges, Western State Teachers College. This picture is actually taken by the time the name had been changed. The name was changed to Western State Teachers College in 1927. Originally it was known as Western State Normal School. Here you have East Hall in all its splendor. Here's North Hall, here's West Hall, here is the Oakland Gym. These were the barracks, and these were brought to the university during World War I, and they stayed there and provided classrooms for students. Here's Kalamazoo College, and in the hill here you can see Kalamazoo College 1933, because they were celebrating their centennial. So both schools were growing. Kalamazoo College, their president, Alan Hoban, in the 1920s, went on a very large building construction program between the 1920s and the early 1930s. So a lot of growth there. As far as healthcare goes, not only did we have the state hospital, and it was known as the Kalamazoo State Hospital by the 1920s, the name changed during the previous decade, but we had growth in healthcare. Bronson Hospital, which had originally started around the turn of the 20th century, was reorganized in 1920. Originally it was known as the Kalamazoo Hospital, And in 1920, the Methodist Church took it over, so it became known as Bronson Methodist Hospital. This is a photograph of the building that was on John Street. The building is gone, came down about 19 years ago. And the original building was right here, and then an addition was put on in 1928. And I have to say again, a lot of the photographs you're seeing today is due to the archives of the Kalamazoo Gazette. As far as Borges goes, Borges was originally located on Portage Street in the James Walter House. And by the 1920s, there had been an addition that had been put onto the building because the house set further back from the street. So they had all this space to put an addition on. It was located at Portage and the intersection of Portage and a street that no longer exists anymore called Spring Street. But it was before you got to Lovell. And it was on the west side of the street. So that's where it was located. So they had an addition that they had put on. But they had already, by 1920, they'd already moved. And this is a photograph of the Borges Hospital on Gull Road that was completed in 1917. And they continued to have both what they referred to as Old Borges and New Borges until 1929, when they sold this building to the Upjohn Company and then added on to the facility on Gull Road. As far as religion goes, we continued to build new church buildings, but in the 1920s, there were some things that sort of pushed along the construction of 3 churches in Kalamazoo. Okay. The 3 of the churches in the downtown area burned within a 6-month time period. We had the First Congregational, which was located on Church Square, where First Congregational is located now. That one burned in December of 1925. First Methodist, which I know this is a real blurry photograph, but this is looking on Rose Street towards Lovell. You're looking south. You can see First Methodist here, which was located where the telephone building is now. That one came down in June of 1926. And March of 1926. And First Presbyterian, which was located on the corner of South and Rose Street, where the building is, literally across the street from the entrance to the library, and that came down in June. So that was December, March, and June. In fact, this is a photograph that one might see a lot. This is the fire of the First Methodist Church in March of 1926. There had been a previous fire that had taken down the steeple, but this one was a total loss. Well, what that resulted in was some major construction as far as churches go. Although I think that there had already been plans by one congregation to move, you had 3 new buildings that were built within a 2-year time period, 2 to 3 year time period. The first one was First Methodist. That was completed in 1928 on a different location from where they had been located before. First Methodist located where they are now on South Park Street and almost at the intersection of South Park and Academy. So actually I should go back first. First Congregational is first. First Congregational was 1928, designed by Amar Embry on the location of where the church building had been previously. First Methodist is 1929, and then First Presbyterian moved to South and St. John Street, and that was 1930. Another thing that was going on in the 1920s was some changes to Bronson Park, and that was the introduction of a different fountain. What we see here is the Duncan McCall fountain, and that came in around that time period, about where the, not exactly the same location of where the fountain was located that was taken down last year, but you can see First Reformed Church right here. You can see the old jail and the courthouse. So we're dating this right now because the courthouse looks like it's doing quite well, and the courthouse was built in 1937. So this is actually later than the 20s, but it's the McCall fountain was in the 1920s. Speaking of Bronson Park, in 1929, there was a city planner that came to Kalamazoo, and Jacob Crane, he was a consultant. And his report was very, very interesting because he talked about a lot of different things in the city, but one of the things he talked about was what he referred to as the Civic Center. And so what his report recommended, because the Bronson Park was surrounded, okay, you had Church Square and you had the Courthouse Square. You had the first Church of Christ Scientists that was built, around 1913, 1912, 13. But for the most part, you had a lot of houses around the park area. The YWCA had gone up in 1919. But what Jacob Crane had recommended was a total change of that area around the park and to make it more civic rather than residential. And you can see in his drawing here, now one of the things that he doesn't have here that we still have here, of course, is the park building, the William Lawrence building. But you can see his designs for some of or what he proposed. I think just to give you an idea, they weren't exactly proposed to be the true designs of the building, but he has the courthouse, he has City Hall actually directly across from the courthouse. We know that that didn't work, that wasn't what happened. But you could see First Methodist, here's First Reformed, not exactly First Baptist Church over here. And here he has First Presbyterian. So I know it's just a drawing, but the idea of Bronson Park becoming more of a civic center was already forming by the time that Jacob Crane came to town, but I think he really reinforced it. By the time he was doing that, we had some houses around. This is an idea of some of the houses around Bronson Park. This one still remains. This is the William Lawrence house, which is now part of the Park Club. That was a private home probably until the teens. Then it became a lot of different things. Later, a private club, and it became the Park Club in 1927. Next door to this was the Frank Millam home, which was on the corner of South and St. John Place. And in the 1920s, this was City Hall from like 1925 until the construction of the new City Hall, which was located on there. There were two houses that served as City Hall. There was the Millam House and then the Orcutt House behind it. So a lot of things happening in Kalamazoo in the 1920s. And here we have a picture of City Hall, which was completed in 1931, designed by the Chicago architectural firm of Weary and Alford in the Art Deco style. We had some other institutions that were really growing at this time. They had already been established previously, but as far as buildings go, they were really coming up. This was the YWCA building, designed by Robinson and Campaw, which we will talk about. The first part of the building, now the YWCA started in the 1880s, started around 1885, and they had been in various locations, but this was their first permanent home on South Rose Street. The first part of the building was built in 1919. The front part was completed in 1923. Also the Salvation Army, and we'll refer a little bit more to these further on. The Salvation Army, of course, has been a part of Kalamazoo for many years, but in 1927, they completed their citadel on the corner of North Rose and Eleanor Street, so improving the life of Kalamazoo. Cultural institutions were really seeing a growth at this time in the 1920s. We have a wonderful quote here from the Chamber of Commerce, talking specifically about our museum, the Kalamazoo Public Museum at the time. As far as our cultural institutions, well, the Kalamazoo Public Library, told you one of my favorite places. This is the building that was built, completed in 1893, was designed by the firm Patton and Fisher, and was funded by the Van Duzens. And we have wonderful portraits of the Van Duzens as you were coming into the building. That really gave one of the largest donations to the school board at that time in the 1890s to fund the construction of this building, which sat, as you can see, on the corner of South and Rose Street. Dr. Van Duzen had actually chosen the site for the location of the library. They wanted to expand the building, I know. They didn't, but they did expand it in other different ways for other different purposes for the library at this time period. But before we get into that, let's talk about another thing that happened in the 1920s when you're talking about culture. And now we go back to Mr. Todd, Mr. A.M. Todd. I already referred to him and his mint. A.M. Todd, who was known as the Peppermint King, had started his mint business in 1869 and brought it to Kalamazoo in 1891 and located the factory for the mint company on the corner of Rose and Kalamazoo Avenue, where the county administration building is right now. He traveled back and forth and purchased a variety of materials. His interest was very, I don't want to say eclectic, but it was varied as far as what he collected and brought back to Kalamazoo. Paintings, sculpture, items from all over the world, Native American baskets, items from Japan, China, Babylonian clay tablets, glassware, and also books. He really loved rare books. He stored them, well, at his home, but he also had them here in the Todd building. And he opened the rooms to the public free of charge for them to come and see the collection. There were 22 rooms that were filled with his collection. And in April of 1925, the newspaper talks about 3,000 people showed up for 4 hours between the hours of 2 and 6 o'clock on a Sunday to see the collection. And I mean, just look at this. Here are some of the paintings. The thing with Todd, some of the paintings are copies of originals. When he bought the paintings, there's some really fine work by Thomas Hill, Harry Best, who are artists in California, and many other fine paintings. The porcelain ranged from English, German, Japanese, just really interesting collection. And you get a feeling here of the kinds of books. A lot of his rare books are at Kalamazoo College. They have the A.M. Todd Rare Book Room as part of the library at Kalamazoo College. Here is another photograph of how it went from room to room to room. Well, in the 1920s, he began to disperse a lot of his collection to public institutions. To the Kalamazoo schools, he gave a great number of paintings that were hung in some of the school buildings. He gave a great deal of material to the now Kalamazoo Valley Museum. Not the mummy, that was someone else, but a lot of the items that when you go into their exhibit on the mummy and Egypt, a lot of those items came from A.M. Todd. So quite an eclectic collection. So what did the museum do? Well, previous to this, the museum was located in a room down in the basement of the public library. And in 1927, the school board purchased the Peck home, which was right next to the library. And this became the home of the Kalamazoo Museum. And it remained their home for about the next 30 years. And a lot of the items from the Todd collections and from Donald Butterman and from other individuals that had donated were here at the house. Well, then if we go further to the south, there was one more house on that block, and that was the Coffer House. The school board also purchased that, and that became the art house. So they had their, the art department for the library was located there, and also it was a very early home for the Kalamazoo Institute of Arts. They moved here in 1924. So in the 1920s, you can say there was almost this little cultural district along South Rose Street with the library, the museum, and the art house located right next to one another where we are today. Kalamazoo Symphony started in 1921. They're getting ready to celebrate their centennial, which will be coming up in a couple years. As far as in the 1920s, where did people hear art, or music, presentations? Well, 1924, what we know as Chenery Auditorium had been built within Kalamazoo Central High School. Chenery Auditorium, named for Howard Chenery, but back then it was not. When I did some research on Central High School, and this was the fourth school built on this site. It was built in different parts between 1912 and 1922. The auditorium, as I said, was built 2 years later in 1924. The thing that was interesting when you look at the way that they approved millages for schools, this one for Central High School specifically stated that it was going to have an auditorium that was going to seat 3,000 people, and people voted for it. Obviously, it doesn't seat 3,000 right now, but for Kalamazoo, that was such a big step because previous to this, any sort of music performances might be held maybe at the Academy of Music, which was on South Rose Street, maybe the Armory, maybe the Masonic Temple. But to have an auditorium like this that was designed specifically for that in mind was really a treat. We did have a lot of movie theaters, and in 1927, this one was built, the State Theater, designed by John Eberson, and one of what I was told only about a dozen atmospheric theaters that are left in the United States. And it's such a treat that we still have that. Civic was a little bit later. They did get started in the 1920s, the Civic Players, and this building was completed in 1931 and designed by the architect Amar Embury. So who built these buildings? Well, a lot of individuals. If you look at the city directory in the 1920s, you'll see some familiar names that you might know, names that I've already mentioned. Dan Albertson was an engineer, not really an architect, and he designed a lot of the paper mills in Kalamazoo, and there was a lot of new buildings going up for that industry. Ernest Batterson, as I mentioned, was a local architect, and I've always gotten a big kick out of looking at 3 of his buildings because there seemed to be a similarity in these 3, and they were all built fairly close together. We talked about the Salvation Army, which was 1927, First Methodist Church, which was 1928. This is Wilson Elementary School over on the east side, which no longer exists. This is either, I've read either 1927 or 1929. What do you find similar in all these 3? That Gothic arch on all of them. I've also pointed out when we've gone on our walks, there's a house on Long Road that he built. If you go down Long Road, it's the house that used to have a tennis court in the front of it, sort of like at the base of the hill. That was one that Batterson also designed, and that doesn't have the Gothic arch, but it has about the same sort of stonework that you see, very similar to what you see on First Methodist. The other list are names who I never knew these gentlemen previously, but I know of their work. Rockwell Leroy, who designed Chenery Auditorium, also designed some buildings for Oakwood Park on Woods Lake, also designed Lincoln Elementary. Forrest Van Bolkenberg, who did the Central Fire Station, but also did the neighborhood fire station buildings that still exist on Charlotte Street and North Street and Southwest Nidge. Goes on and on and on. Gilbert Warden, who designed Gibson. So a lot of these names are so familiar to me. Howard Young, who did a lot of residential buildings, like the faculty houses at Kalamazoo College, as an example. But then we have these individuals. Milton Clayton James Billingham, or MCJ Billingham, and Leslie Cobb. I always like to find out, if I can, how did these 2 get together? As I said, they were a very prolific firm that existed at this time period. Well, it was easy to find information about Mr. Billingham, and you can see it here. Born in Cass County, came to go to Western. I don't have any evidence that he graduated, but I know he was here for a couple years. You can see some familiar names here. Worked with Mr. Albertson for a short time, went off on his own, and then eventually joined Mr. Shoemaker's firm. Meanwhile, can't find that same sort of information for Mr. Cobb, and I really tried hard, but found out where he was born, and he also worked with Mr. Shoemaker. So there you might have one of the ways that the 2 of them met. They may have known each other beforehand. Billingham was the architect, Cobb was more of the engineer in there. So fortunately, you have wonderful things like newspapers that will give you information about this. And what we have here was actually an article that was, or an ad, that was in the January 6, 1916 issue of the Kalamazoo Gazette, announcing the creation of this firm. And at that time, Billingham had been working on a paper company with Shoemaker, and he was still working on plans, but they were forming their new company. I found out that, again, I know that Cobb had come to Grand Rapids, don't know how he came to Kalamazoo, but still that was pretty good. One of the things that Billingham worked on previous to this, or at least, well, one of the first jobs that they had, they were not the architects of record for the YWCA building. As I said, it was Robinson and Campaw from Grand Rapids, which were the same firm that did the front part of the Kalamazoo Central building. Well, actually, they did the entire design of what is now Old Central. And this was 1922, 1923. And in fact, here we have 2 Robinson and Campaw buildings. I know that Billingham was not the architect of record, but he was more than likely the local architect that worked with the builders, at least on the YWCA building. And these both were Robinson and Campaw from Grand Rapids. As far as what they were involved with, well, we already mentioned the Rex Paper Company. When we look at industrial, Billingham and Cobb were involved with a lot of different projects. Along with that, this looks very similar to the picture that we saw previously. I know that they also were involved with designing new additions for the Kalamazoo Stove Company, Claridge Fan Company, and they designed the A.M. Todd building on Douglas Avenue that came up in 1929. As far as hospitals and healthcare, Fairmont Hospital, over in what we call the West Douglas neighborhood, up on the hill, there's a dog park located there now, was a tuberculosis, smallpox, and I don't know if it was also diphtheria or not, hospital originally owned by the city, later owned by the county. In the early 1930s, they had put an addition to an administration building. The Civic is also on their list, and I have a feeling that they were, again, maybe the local architects. They were not the main architect of the building, because that was Amar Embry, as we mentioned. They also, though, designed Washington Square Library in the Tudor Revival style. This was done in 1927. Billingham and Cobb worked a lot with O.F. Miller, the construction company. And so a lot of the projects, you'll see that they were the architects and O.F. Miller were the builders. Washington Square Library, that branch originally began in 1910 in Edison Elementary. They moved to a storefront in 1919, and then this building was completed for them in 1927. Just a classic. See, here we've got that Gothic, that arched entryway, high-pitched roof. We've got some dormers coming off that side, and some gables. Just a wonderful Tudor revival. This also came from the Gazette archives. It looks like either construction's going on or I don't know if it's totally complete, but just a very interesting photograph. Now, he did not, as far as I know, the firm did not have anything to do with the design of KVP, but they were involved with the design of the Kindleberger House. The only photo that I have so far that shows the house a little bit comes courtesy of the Parchment Library. And I don't think they had anything to do with the design of the fire truck. I do know that. Although if you know the history of KVP, know that that was one of the things that Jacob did. Jacob provided, Mr. Kindleberger, I should say, I don't know him well enough to call him Jacob, provided a lot of services for the people of Parchment, including fire, water, and other things. But if you look in the back here, you can see the house that Billingham and Cobb designed for Jacob Kindleberger. So they did residential. They did some residential. It was called a beautiful and commodious residence. It was Italian Renaissance, made of brick and stucco. This I found very interesting. Not so much the first part, but the last word. Okay, so it was built in 1921. It had a drawing room, a dining room, 4 master bedrooms, a private den, a sleeping porch, and a rathskeller. Now, when you hear the word rathskeller, what do you think? Yes, that's what I think too. I think alcohol. I tried finding out if there was any other definition for that. Could not. Mr. Kindleberger came from Germany, or his ancestry was German. But very, very interesting. There was an addition put on in the back of the building. Currently, this building is vacant, but if you were to drive down Riverview, you're not going to see that view. You're going to see a building in front of it that was built on the wide lawn in front, but Kindleberger. Another house that I know that Billingham and Cobb designed was this one on Academy Street in the West Main Hill neighborhood. This is the Murray House. Mr. Murray was the president of the Kalamazoo Label Company. And this one, which was completed in 1926, had a carriage house, which you can see behind the house down on South Street in the West Main Hill neighborhood. They had a servant's quarters, and it said that when this was built, it had a full-time gardener. So very interesting. What I find with these architects that I look into, I don't have their complete list of their projects, and I keep adding on as I find them, find things in the newspapers and any sort of information that I can find about different buildings that they build. Now, why do I get interested in this is because I want to see can I see any patterns? Not so much with Billingham and Cobb. Another residential building that the firm designed was this one. This is another building that came up in the 1920s, the Marlborough. This is a drawing. The Kalamazoo Gazette archives is a very interesting resource. We acquired it probably about 7 years ago at the archives. They purged a lot of the photographs that they had before 1960. Around 1960, they purged everything older than 1960. But there were a few that remained, and I never quite know how some remained and some were gone. This is an example of it. And some of the older photographs that you've seen, I don't know, again, how those survived, and so much of it did not. And it's amazing, like something like this. Here you see a drawing of the building and Billingham and Cobb, and like photographs like this. Marlborough came in 1924. It was Mission Revival. You can see up here again, a roof very similar to that Kalamazoo Gazette building up there at the top. And if you look at the entryway, that recessed entryway, you'll see that same type of little half-tile roof there. It's also got some very interesting brackets up here below that roof line. So 1924. I love it how they just don't say no parking on their signs. They say no parking, please. They're very polite back then in the 1920s, I'm sure. Okay. Where I really got introduced to Billingham and Cobb is in education and in schools. And I love schools. I loved going to school too, except for sometimes we won't get into certain days. But I've really liked researching the history of the Kalamazoo Public Schools. And this was the front part of that. When I showed you the inside of that handout with all the photos of the schools, this was the front of it. It came out in 1927. And so many times these supplements or booklets would come out from the schools to tout what they were doing and brag about their progress. Now, of course, they should brag too. But remember, there was a big growth of students, and they were going to need schools, and especially as the population was extending to the northeast, west, south. So in this one, you can see some of the drawings of the schools, some of the names. We talked about Lake Street, but you see some of the names that sound familiar. When we look at education, okay. Billingham and Cobb at this time were responsible for all of these schools. Now, some of them do not remain anymore. There's only one. There's only one here on the sheet. No, two. I'm sorry. There are two on this. We've got 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8. We've got 8 schools that came out in the 1920s, all designed by Billingham and Cobb. Now, they were not the only architects that built schools. But so many times when you read the school board minutes, yes, I enjoy reading the school board minutes by this time. Don't ask me why, I don't know. But it was interesting, as I mentioned, how if a new school needed to be built because of growth of population, what they would do, they would put the issue on the ballot, but they would put an individual issue for each school. So not like now where they put a millage, a large millage on, knowing that there's going to be all these different projects. So it would be to your benefit, for example, if you lived in the Westnedge Hill neighborhood, to make sure that you voted and you got your neighbors to vote for that one issue about building the school in that neighborhood. And I always found that to be interesting when I read it. So there were other schools, though, at that time. So what we have here that were built in the 1920s, this is Lincoln, and this was done by Rockwell Leroy. We talked about Ernest Batterson, who did this in the late 1920s over on the east side, Wilson Elementary. And then this was one that Ernest Batterson also did. This is South Westnedge, which is where the Paramount Charter Academy is located, on South Westnedge. And he also did that one in 1927. So not just in the city of Kalamazoo, but also in Kalamazoo Township, which was part of the Kalamazoo Public Schools even then at that time period. As far as Billingham and Cobb, 1921, here's Woodward Avenue. This is the section of the building that is on North Street. That came out, was 1921. The next one was Washington, 1922, which is no longer here. Although what the schools did is they did save one of these arches that they put in the new building. And there's this wonderful historical display in there about the history of Washington Elementary and the Edison neighborhood, put together by somebody that you might know who's anyway. It was a really good exhibit. Anyway, I put in an exhibit there for them to talk about the history of the schools. One of the things I didn't touch on in the 1920s, we also had we had a change of names for some of the schools. I've mentioned this before in other programs. For whatever reason, I'm not sure, but there are several schools that changed their names to reflect presidents of the United States. So, for example, this used to be called Portage Street School, but it became Washington Elementary. You have East that becomes Roosevelt. You have Frank that becomes Lincoln. And even the new schools, we talked about Wilson, so they took on names of presidents. I don't know how extensive they were going to complete that, because it sort of ended, and for whatever reason, I don't know why. Edison was a name that was chosen by the parents of Lake Street School, so that was not deemed from the public schools. That came from the parents in there, and it was not long after Thomas Edison had passed away in the 1930s. So Washington Elementary. Now what you'll notice about these schools is that many of them are built in the style of what they called collegiate Gothic, which is a style that was very popular for educational buildings at that time. Central is an example of collegiate Gothic. One of the things you see with these schools is that arched entryway, the decoration up here at the top, the crenellations down here at Washington Elementary, the shields, the other features in here for collegiate Gothic. This is one that's near and dear to my heart. This is Parkwood. Parkwood came up in 1922. There was an addition that was put in 1931 because of the growth. You'll notice I did not say Parkwood Upjohn Elementary, which is what it is known as now, because at this time in the 1920s, it was just Parkwood. The Upjohn School, the Harold Upjohn School, was built in the 1930s, and they really were separate schools at that time until they were joined and actually physically connected. So we have Parkwood, and then the addition that was put on about 9 years afterwards. This is McKinley, which used to be called South Burdick, which is another one of the Billingham and Cobb schools that no longer remains. This was taken down, and this is where the Salvation Army is located now. And this one was completed in 1924. Now this Billingham and Cobb school still exists, but not in this kind of format. You probably pass by it many, many times and never see it because it's hidden. This is Harding Elementary that was built in 1925. And this has sort of been encircled by Bronson Hospital. And if you stand now, because of all the, a lot of the buildings that were taken down at the intersection of St. John and Lovell Street, and you can see it a little more. It was built on the corner. Well, it was on Lovell Street, and I'm trying to think of what that Pine Street. It was Lovell and Pine. There was Lovell Elementary School that it was built behind the old Lovell Street. What I found interesting about this one, here's another view. I don't know if you can see it, but that entryway here looks very Art Deco. I don't know what the design was all about. I'm going to go back to this photograph. I don't know if you can really see it all that well. But it's different from what I've seen in some of the other Billingham and Cobb buildings. You don't have that arched entryway like what you had before. What was interesting about Harding School when this one was built in 1925, in the teens and the 20s, Kalamazoo had embraced the open air movement, the open air school, as a means of trying to deal with students that either had, that were susceptible to tuberculosis, that needed the fresh air to make them healthy. At this time, in the teens, we had Edwin Desenberg, who started Pretty Lake Camp, of a means of getting kids out to nature. And so with Harding, when they built it, one of the things that they had areas up on the roof that students could go up there and be immersed in fresh air. So they integrated a little bit of the open air school there at Harding. And then there's the view that we looked at before, again, named for Warren G. Harding. This is part of, I'm not sure if this is exactly what they built, but this is North Westnedge. Billingham and Cobb built an addition to this building in 1926 on North Westnedge, and you can see some similarities there. They've got the name up there just like with Harding. The crenellations down here, so a little more subdued. Different entryway from what we've seen before. Here we have a little bit of a swag over here, a little bit of symbols up here that deal with education. These two buildings are interesting because they look like they are the same building, but they are not. Because two of the buildings that Billingham and Cobb designed in 1926 were Hillcrest and West Main. Hillcrest here built on Cherry Street, now where the Kazoo School is located now, and West Main Street that is still there. The school system still owns it. It's no longer a school, but they have offices and other things there. But look at the similarity in the arched side entry to the buildings. And those both came up in 1926. And both had additions that were put on them that, at least in West Main's case and Hillcrest, at least West Main came down. So that. And the one school that definitely was not collegiate Gothic that Billingham and Cobb designed was Woodward Elementary. On Stewart, or I should say the front entryway is on Stewart. This one was constructed in 1929. Very, very different from what they've done before. This was Georgian colonial revival and has an incredible portico with the triangular pediment and the columns. It's got these fan-light windows for these entrances. It's got, here we've got a broken pediment. We've also got some coins. I always like to spell it out, Q-U-O-I-N-S, over here in the corners. We've got some cornices or decoration over these windows. That incredible tower with a clock in it. And when you look at this would be the front entrance or the entrance that is on the west side of the building. If you go over to the east side of the building from the parking lot, it's got that same rhythm with the portico and the columns and the windows. Absolutely wonderful. Just massive, very large school that Billingham and Cobb designed. Well, so what happened after this? For whatever reasons, certainly I'm not going to find it in the Kalamazoo Gazette, the firm split. And Billingham, though, continued to work as an architect in Kalamazoo for many years after that. Leslie Cobb went into various positions. I know that he was a longtime employee of the Upjohn Company. He passed away in 1957. Billingham continued his practice. One of the buildings that he was involved with was the 3rd County Courthouse on Courthouse Square. And this one was really very interesting in doing some research about this building. The voters had approved funds for a new county courthouse in 1934, and between that and money that the county received from the Public Works Administration, a New Deal program, they were able to construct this building. Billingham was the local architect. The main architect was a firm in Detroit, but the thing that Billingham did was change the design. The original design was more of a cross-type plan, and Billingham wanted more of a block plan. The other thought that I thought was really interesting is this was about maybe 5 years after City Hall had been built. And Billingham wrote that he wanted a building that harmonized with the municipal building, with City Hall. And so he also embraced Art Deco in this building. He said that it must be a type of architecture far removed from anything that might be only a passing fancy. So he identified Art Deco as a style that was going to continue. He assured the board that he would hire qualified draftsmen from Kalamazoo. there were, if you remember, on the entryways, there were ornamental bronze grills. I'm not sure, I haven't found yet who designed them. They are no longer there. They came down in the 1980s. But those had different symbols for industry, education, commerce, law, and science. The figures above the doorways, not all the doorways, but at least this entryway and the West Michigan entryway, and then if I'm not sure if it's on Church Street or not. These were designed by Corrado Parducci, and he is also involved with the decorations in Detroit. A lot of artwork that he did in Detroit on a lot of the buildings. It was said that this building represents all that is new in architectural beauty and efficiency. It's going to be very interesting to see what happens to the county courthouse, because I don't know if you're familiar that the building was sold by the county commission to Plaza Corp. The county is leasing the building for the next 5 years before they build their new county building that will face Kalamazoo Avenue. So I'll be interested to see what plans Plaza Corp has for the building and what will be going on there and how they will be handling it, handling the building. So the county courthouse. Another building that MCJ Billingham was involved with, and that was the Douglas Community Association on Ransom Street, that was completed in 1940. This was the house that MCJ Billingham lived in. His firm, he was eventually joined by Gerald Diekema, and the firm of Diekema Hammond is the ancestor, I guess you could say. Not the ancestor, but they are the firm now that Billingham and Cobb were a part of. At the archives, we received a number of architectural plans that were done by Billingham and Cobb via Diekema Hammond, which were very nice to see. In fact, some of those buildings that we've talked about this evening, especially a lot of the school buildings, we have the architectural drawings for those buildings. So in the 1930s, we know that the economy was slowing down. Not only was the economy slowing down, but also construction. In getting ready for this program, you're trying to think of, well, where can I find information to illustrate that? And one of the things I went through were the City of Kalamazoo annual reports. And in those annual reports, they'll talk about house construction. And between 1920 and 1929, there was an average of 192 houses per year that were built in Kalamazoo. That's an average. Between 1930 and 1939, there were 40. Now, keep in mind, when you're looking at the Great Depression, remember that you had the beginning of the decade where there were the depths of the Depression, but then by the end of the decade, you might have a little bit of an uplift into the economy a little bit, so I don't know how reflective that is. But those figures sort of illustrate what was going on during that time period. There was not a lot of construction going on. This is South Burdick Street. This is, again, we're in what we now know as the Burdick Mall. This building is still there, Montgomery Ward. Here we have the International Block. That is still there. Some of the buildings are still there, including the Fuller Theater, which is not the Fuller Theater anymore, but a lot of other buildings that are still, maybe not on this block, because this right here is the old Upjohn block that is gone. The Mall Plaza is located there right now. And what year was that? I really haven't found out, Nelson, but I could probably find out easily by looking at some of the other businesses that we can see there. I could also try to get in there and see what those license plates say. But pretty nice. This is another one. Here we have, again, Michigan Avenue. We're sort of like on the other side of the street from that first photo I showed you of Main Street. Here we have the Burdick Hotel. There's the Hanselman Building. Here we have the Dewing Building, which also came up in the 1920s, an example there. And here we have that Michigan Avenue, and then turning that way, here's Portage Street right over here. So that gives you an example right there. So things eventually did pick up, especially after World War II, and more changes in our built environment. But what is really wonderful is that we still have a lot of the examples of those buildings that were built during that decade that are still here today and are still being used. Woodward Elementary, First Methodist Church, Parkwood Upjohn Elementary, and then down here, I didn't cover this, but this is Carolyn Bartlett Crane's Everyman's House on South Westnedge that was constructed in the 1920s for the national competition that she won. So, and of course the county building. I had to throw these in because the archives, we have a lot of county records for a 12-county area in southwestern Michigan, and one of the things that we have, which I was able to go through, was a wonderful photo album that had every detail of the construction of that building. And so this was taken, there's the old jail that was built in the 19th century, and the county building today. All right, the end to my program. Thank you. Anybody have any questions or comments, or Nelson?
County building or
PWA. PWA. Well, but it wasn't just Public Works Administration, because they also received money from the voters in 1934. So yeah, it was Public Works Administration at that time. John?
Lynn, have you ever discovered how the naming plan came about that ended up with Parkwood, Westwood, Oakwood, Lakewood?
Go back to the hill. I don't know exactly who was involved with naming that, but I think it reflects this whole back to nature movement.
Right, yeah.
Oakwood,
Yeah.
Hillcrest. I mean, when you look at the names that the developers chose, now I've never found out who was the one that specifically came up with the name of this neighborhood for Westwood, but a lot of the plats, when you go through the subdivisions at that time period, I mean, look at Sunrise Heights. You know, you look at even the names of the streets in my neighborhood, which Pat and Rich and the Patchells know so well. I mean, you've got Creston, Montrose, Edgemore, you know, all reflecting this thing about, again, getting into your head the need of, you know, you're getting out into nature. So I don't think it was one individual person that would come up, you know, came up with that. I think it was a number of the developers that did in any way to entice you, to advertise it, you know, to make you, you know, think about, you know, wanting to, if you can't make it to Charlevoix, go to the West Main Hill neighborhood, you know, just be the same. I love it. I just thought when I read that, it's just so funny when you read it. But obviously they succeeded because a lot of people, you know, agreed with something like that. Pat.
And well, I was going to say it was orchard land too, where we lived to begin with. That's why we have to watch for termites.
Yep.
So maybe it was a tie also to the past, tying the past to the future.
Sure.
That it was kind of nature. But I was wondering, have you found obituaries for Billingham and?
I did, but they didn't say very much.
They didn't tell you.
I'm always looking for. This sounds really weird. I'm always looking for obituaries because I'm always hoping that obituaries will tell me, especially because I have this long list for a lot of these architects in Kalamazoo with buildings that they designed. And I'm always hoping that the obituaries might tell me some more buildings that I may not be familiar with. And a lot of cases they don't. Now Cobb, I'm very little on even, I don't think there's even anything mentioned about working with Billingham and Cobb. Obituaries sometimes can give you a great amount of information and sometimes they don't really give you. And with Mr. Billingham's, there really wasn't all that much information about he did this and this and this. A lot of this I've pieced together by looking at the plans that we have. And we only have a small portion of the plans that Deacon Hammond has. They have all of the plans for the county building that they still maintain. So I've just slowly been able to piece these together. Rich?
First, on the issue of names for these areas, if you look at names today, it's an awful lot of hype, and all these developments don't seem to have much to do with whatever their name is.
Well, it is, I guess I have to, I agree with you on that, especially because living in the Weston Chill neighborhood, which I have, my husband and I and our family have been living in this neighborhood for many, many years. When they said that they were on the top of a hill, we are on the top of the hill, as opposed to, like you said, some of the new developments when they're, you know, flat, you know, no trees or anything else like that. But yes, I think they're still trying to promote the same type of feeling.
So my actual question though is, in the first photo you showed of downtown, with the white dress,
Yeah,
you said it was 1915?
about
And
1915.
then the next one was maybe 5 years later?
Yeah.
The first one had lots of horses and carriages. The second one had none at all. Is that when the transition really happened?
Well, I keep in mind that as historians we have this wonderful thing called circa. So when I say circa 1915, that could fall anywhere between 1910 and 1905. No, it actually is 1910 to 1920, around in that area. When I said circa 1920 for that second photograph, I might have been a little bit short. It might have been a little bit later than that, as far as that goes. I do know that that first one was probably about 1915 because of a Hanselman building. I would say maybe that would have been more mid-1920s rather than 1920, as I was thinking.
So when do you think horses became really infrequent in the cities on the streets of the city like Kalamazoo?
I wish I could say that that was in the annual reports for the city of Kalamazoo, but unfortunately it wasn't, although I'm sure I could probably find that information digging in somewhere. I'm sure that, I'm thinking that by the time of the probably, I don't want to say late teens, because I think that they still had, some probably still might have had it, definitely in the 1920s. And a lot of that too corresponds with the economy and people being able to afford cars or something like that. So, I don't know, but that would be an interesting one to try to find.
Wasn't there a streetcar that came up West?
Yes, there was, Natalie. In fact, the streetcar that came up the hill actually, for a long time, stopped there at the hill at Inkster and then turned around and then went back. And that's one of the things that encouraged the development in so many of these neighborhoods, especially in the 1920s and in the teens and the 20s, is because you had public transportation and you didn't need a car. And now what kind of turnaround, and they may not even have had a turnaround, they may have just gone up the hill and then come down. Keeping in mind that that hill was a little steeper than what it is right now. But yeah, that's probably until about 1893, I think it was, 1893, the boundary for the city of Kalamazoo, at least on that south side, ended sort of at the top of the hill and then later expanded a little bit further. Yes?
The plats might be of interest in terms of when the platting was done. For example, Cherry Hill or up in the West Main area, that entire plat was done in 1869. So if you knew how these different plats, maybe that would give us an idea of the...
When you say plats in 1869,
Yeah.
saying West Main,
Yeah.
actually, West Main, well, it depends, I guess, on where you're looking, because the West Main Hill neighborhood was not done until Frank Henderson.
So what date was that?
That was in the 1890s, because he hired, it was the first landscape, it was a landscape plan, landscape development, where the roads followed the contour of the land. And that's another thing I find interesting, because when you look at the development of the West Main Hill neighborhood, you had Frank Hodgman, who was a surveyor in Kalamazoo County, and you also had Annette McCrae. And Annette McCrae, I've been interested in, haven't been able to find too much about her, and it was said that she was one of the first female landscape architects, and she was involved with the planning of West Main Hill. You may have had maybe a plan of West Main, of the hill of West Main, but when you look at the subdivisions, and we've got, in fact, if you go down to the local history room, Beth has in her collection the Chad, I think you still might have the Chad books in there, and that has a lot of the copies of the plats. Keeping in mind that a lot of these plats were planned and then were changed or added on, whatever. I was looking at today Greater Lakeway Park, which is in the Millwood neighborhood, and that was like around 1925. So if you're looking at the 1860s, you're looking more towards that middle of the city, because keep in mind that they really couldn't get up those hills until you had a way of getting up those hills, which was the streetcar, and the streetcar didn't come until the 1880s. So that was one way. Again, yeah, Stewart neighborhood, West Douglas, the areas that were fairly flat, and they didn't have to make it up that hill. Yes?
When did the streetcars stop being used?
I think the transition, I'm going to guess again in the 1920s, where you had that transition. They were still around in the teens. Now exactly, that's another interesting thing, is looking at transportation as far as Might be even in the 30s. I'm not sure. We'd have to go back and look. Because when you think about it, if you look at that photograph that we had in the 1920s, you still have the streetcar tracks there. They transitioned from horses to electricity in the 1890s. So I think they were probably still around until the buses, and now that I think of it, I think the buses were like in the when you had the bus system, which originally was not, if I'm not mistaken, was not really a city bus system originally, but please don't quote me on that. That was more of the 1930s, I think, that you had that. Anything else?
When was the overhead power lines put in for the buses? It wasn't really streetcars, they were.
Oh.
Didn't they have it was in the, wasn't it back, like in the 1940s and 50s, that they still had the overhead power lines?
I can't remember seeing them on any photographs. I would have to look on that, but I'm rather doubting that there was anything like that for that, but I have to check into that. Another thing for me to look at. So many things to look at. Yes?
Was the Mr. Crane who designed the plan for Benson Park, was he the same person that did the Crane?
No. Jacob Crane really didn't design the park. He had given recommendations on it. The design of the park, Alfonso Iannelli was the one that designed the walkways and the Fountain of the Pioneer, and then the corresponding water, not the fountain, but the other thing too. So he was one that, I mean, there had been plans for Bronson Park. There had been people planning Bronson Park going back to Alexander Sheldon in the 1850s. But Crane, I think, was more giving recommendations on that. So what you saw in that drawing in the Crane report in 1929 was, I think, a suggestion, and I think, definitely some of the buildings that he had put there, and it may not have been him, it may have been somebody else who designed it, or drew that, I'm not sure, was just, I think, his recommendation for what that area should become.
I was wondering if he was involved with like the Crane Park, it used to be rather a show place up on the Westlands Hill.
No, the Crane Park was actually named for somebody different, Edgar Crane, who owned a house in the neighborhood, and I better make sure I'm saying this correctly because Natalie is here and Natalie will be able to correct me on that. But anyway, so it gets confusing because we've got a lot of Cranes in Kalamazoo because people think that it was named for Carolyn Bartlett Crane, which it was not, and it was Edgar Crane who gave a lot of the land for that park. But the design was not done by Edgar Crane, it was done by, if I'm not mistaken, you had people in the city who designed those beds, didn't you, back in the...
It came in 3 different parcels.
But as far as the design of the garden, the beds, and because I know a lot of that was done during the Depression.
Yeah.
Because what they wanted to do in that park is they wanted to give people an idea of what you could do in your own yards. For one thing, I know that. Like I said, I got to watch it here. Got to watch it. I got the Patchels here. You got to sometimes watch that. Anybody else have any questions? Well, with that, I want to thank you so much for coming this evening. I really do appreciate that. For those of you interested in Michigan history, I hope you'll join me in April. As Beth said, we're going to pick up where we were going to go in January before this wonderful snow apocalypse came upon us over the last 6 weeks. What we will be doing in April is we'll be finishing the 19th century, and we'll be looking at we're looking at urbanization and immigration in Michigan at that time period, and also looking at progressivism. So we'll be doing that in April, and then we'll have another session in May before the season ends, and I lace up my walking shoes and get back outside and walk around the various parts of Kalamazoo and greater Kalamazoo. So thank you very much. Have a nice evening, and hope to see you soon.